Welcome to the Regents Roundtable. I'm Stephen Ludwig. My guest today is Patrick O'Rourke, the Executive Vice Chancellor and Chief Operating Officer for the University of Colorado at Boulder. Prior to that position, he was Vice President, University Counsel for the University of Colorado System, and Secretary to the University of Colorado Board of Regents from 2012 through 2020, and that's where we met and worked together. Patrick has been an adjunct faculty member at the University of Colorado School of Law and the Colorado School of Public Health, which is on the University of Colorado Anschutz Medical Campus in Aurora, Colorado. He's been an adjunct faculty member for more than a decade. The fact that Pat calls me a friend after all this time is a huge honor to me. After I finished this interview with Pat, I realized the two topics we discussed didn't really fit together. They'd be better as standalone podcasts. So I've split this interview into two parts. And the next podcast, we will discuss how board members can work successfully with the board secretary and the board staff. But for this podcast, we're going to talk about academic freedom. And you can imagine that's a really big, exciting, interesting topic. And it really should just be discussed on its own because it's really meaty. So talking about that, academic freedom, the term gets thrown around a lot. And I think it'd be helpful for regents and trustees and people generally interested in higher education to understand what it means in practice and legality. So I asked Pat, what exactly is academic freedom and what is protected and not protected?
So let me start by confirming what you just said, which is that academic freedom is one of those terms that gets used an awful lot, and it is less clear that there's any type of consensus definition. Most people think that academic freedom has something to do with the First Amendment, but the courts across the country so far have not recognized academic freedom as granting special rights to university faculty that other citizens don't have. And so it's related to the First Amendment, but not exactly something that exists independently and legally of its own. I tend to think of academic freedom more as an institutional value. And that institutional value stems from the proposition that in order to be able to have legitimacy of inquiry and scholarship, faculty members have to have the freedom to be able to publish on the topics that they want to publish about, free from censorship from the university. Now, that doesn't mean that it's entirely free of constraint, because if a faculty member is engaged in fabrication, falsification, plagiarism, that's not a defense. But where the university and the administration shouldn't get in the business of is saying we like somebody's research conclusions more than we like somebody else's research conclusions. And so the ability to inquire and publish is part of academic freedom. The other piece of academic freedom is the ability to teach within the classroom without having fear that you're going to be censored in your teaching. Now, but that also isn't a carte blanche license, in the sense that if you have a faculty member who's been hired to teach biology 101 and that person walks in and says, I really don't feel like teaching biology 101. What I really feel like teaching is, music 202, and I brought a flute. Then that's not an academic freedom issue, because that particular faculty member has been engaged and there are expectations for what people are supposed to get for the course that they've signed up for so that they can make progress towards their majors. And so there can be standards for what academic instruction is, evaluation to make sure people are meeting those standards without imposing on academic freedom itself. But the two fundamental core concepts are that the university administration itself won't censor the faculty in terms of what they research and publish, and that they won't have orthodoxy in the classroom that prescribes how what a faculty member should teach.
Got it. So it's if I'm hearing correctly, it's a freedom from interference from the university within standard guidelines, as you said. I like if you're teaching biology, you can't teach music during that course. I got that. And then freedom to go where their research leads them.
Yeah,
So we're not, yeah.
those are key concepts. Now, I would throw in two other kind of wrinkles, which is there's a kind of an emerging academic freedom thing that also is recognizing academic freedom for students, so that they have the ability to practice academic freedom, to be able to express their thoughts on issues that are germane to the subject matter without being penalized by their faculty who might hold different views than they have. So if you had a course in political science and you were debating, which type of governmental system was the best, if you had a student saying, well, I really think that the communist countries function better than democracies, well, the faculty member shouldn't be penalizing you for holding that view. But what the faculty member, just like we talked about before, does have the ability to say, here's the learning content that I need you to be able to demonstrate throughout the course of the class and to have standards. And student academic freedom, again, is not a means by which you say that the student is free from being evaluated and that the content of their expression is not being probed for true academic content. The other thing that you mentioned was the principle of non-interference. And there's a thread of academic freedom that also really looks at what decisions should universities be able to make for themselves. And those include, who should be allowed to teach within the institution, what should be the standards of the institution for graduation, and that they ought to be able to make those type of decisions free from governmental interference. When you're looking at things like what are happening in Florida with laws that are being passed saying you can't teach critical race theory, for example, and you hear universities saying that's a violation of academic freedom, what they're really saying is that it's a violation of the university's ability to determine for itself what should be taught, and that those type of decisions should be made without outside governmental interference. Now, it's a little bit of a fiction. There's always been laws that apply to higher education, and even if you look at it right now, there are standards for accreditation. And so universities don't function completely autonomously, but the general notion of university academic freedom is that universities should be able to have those discussions and chart their own path about what should be taught in their institutions.
Okay. Yeah. And I do get the intellectual challenge with we require outsiders to come in and give us the seal of approval through the accreditation process. So it's not entirely autonomous. Other scholars are having an opinion about what you do.
Yeah.
Yeah. So can you explain, we touched on this a little bit, but can you explain the difference between academic freedom and freedom of speech?
Mm-hmm. So freedom of speech is the concept that is enshrined in the First Amendment to the Constitution, which basically stands for the proposition that the government doesn't have the ability to limit constitutionally protected speech. And not all speech is constitutionally protected. We know, for example, that speech where you're trying to defraud somebody is not constitutionally protected, but things that are on matters of public concern, things that promote public discourse, that's the core of the First Amendment, and all citizens have that. Academic freedom is really thought of as a subset of freedom of speech. And it really looks to what is the speech that is necessary within an academic institution in order to preserve the freedom of inquiry, freedom of expression, freedom of publication. And the courts have referred to academic freedom as, quote, a special concern of the First Amendment, without actually defining very well what that means. But what it's generally meant is that when courts review decisions that are made within academic institutions, they're not going to second guess those. And they're going to say, we give some degree of deference to what occurs within an academic institution, because we know that the role of the judicial system is not to try to tell institutions of higher education how to make genuine academic decisions.
So how about the case where a professor says something controversial outside of the classroom, not necessarily related to their field? Can they get in trouble back at the institution for speech? Is the speech outside of the institution have the same protection? And then we'll talk about the difference between tenured and adjunct faculty.
Yeah, so if it is speech that is occurring purely in that person's private capacity, if say I'm a professor of anthropology and I go on down to city council and I state an opinion that has nothing to do with anthropology, then I have the protections that any other citizen would have under the First Amendment for political speech. And I should not be retaliated against for having engaged in that political speech. The harder question is trying to define for some faculty members what the line is between their professional speech and their personal speech. And that if you are engaged in things that are germane to your discipline, even if it's not occurring within a classroom setting or in a research publication, a lot of people would say those still need to be protected by concepts of academic freedom, because part of scholarship is not just the representation that you make within the academy, it's also the representation that you bring to the public discourse due to the nature of your position. So the hard part is actually determining where those lines fall between when you're acting as a purely public citizen and you are enjoying the protections of freedom of speech generally, and when you're acting in a capacity that's related to your professional obligations, such that it's also an academic freedom issue.
Sounds complicated.
It's a ton of fun.
Yeah. There's a lot of nuance there that I'm sure books have been written about how you parse that. Now, when it comes to, there's a famous case of an adjunct professor at a small liberal arts college that got fired for offending a student. So where does freedom of speech or academic freedom come into that realm?
So first thing that you have to distinguish is, are we talking about a public institution or private institution?
Okay.
Because public institutions like the University of Colorado, like the University of Florida, you name it, we're public institutions. And as that, we're part of the government. So we're obligated to follow First Amendment principles, which include the notion that if it's protected speech, it can't be a basis for taking any type of employment action against somebody.
And I misstated, the person was not fired, their contract was not renewed.
Yep.
Yeah.
And oftentimes, if somebody is not having their contract renewed under circumstances where they otherwise would have, because somebody who didn't like what they said, that would still potentially be an adverse employment action that would give rise to a legal claim. But you have to remember that in a private institution, the First Amendment doesn't apply.
Why is that?
Because the First Amendment is part of the U.S. Constitution, and the Constitution is limitations upon governmental action. So when my 16-year-old daughter says something bratty to my wife, and I say, you can't say that, and she says First Amendment, I have to explain to her that, that doesn't work. But so with private employers, they don't have to respect the First Amendment in the same way. Now, where it gets a little bit tricky is that there are some states like California that have said even private educational institutions aren't allowed to take actions that, if they were taken at a public institution, would violate the First Amendment. So it gets complicated, but I always start with the principle of looking at public or private, because the rules might be different. Then when you go through and you talk about the situation where somebody's contract was non-renewed because somebody took offense of what they said, to me, really the question is, did this person do or say something that demonstrates their inability to perform the essential functions of their position? If you can't function effectively as a faculty member, then you are subject to not having your contract renewed, because that's an expectation of performance, not an act of retaliation because we didn't like what you said.
Yeah.
If it did turn into something, though, where it was simply you offended somebody, that could be a real challenge, because one of the principles that higher ed really needs in order to flourish is the space to be able to have topics not be off limits. As soon as we start prescribing an orthodoxy over this is what you can say and this is what you can't, in legitimate academic discourse, that's a dangerous road to walk down.
What do you think when it comes to trustees or regents, the board for a public or private institution? You're an attorney. You understand this backwards and forwards, but I'm a board member. What should I focus on when it comes to understanding academic freedom and the difference between that and free speech? What are some grounding things I should pay attention to, or should I just have the university counsel on a speed dial?
Here's the first thing that I would tell any board member, which is it's important not to overreact. And
well, what fun is that?
Yeah,
if I can't overreact, what fun is that?
Yeah, I mean that is not fun, but when as a regent you're getting the email from somebody who said, I can't believe you employ this faculty member, or I can't believe that this person said that. It's really easy to feel like you should go into I have to respond mode. And these principles of academic freedom, free speech, all of that are really based upon the notion that there's something more fundamental that you have to protect. And the immediacy of I have to respond oftentimes leads to not a great decision. So the first thing I would say is, take a step back and say, what are the values that are at issue here? The other thing that I would also really be careful about is saying, in the first instance, do we have internal university processes that look at this in a way that will allow me as a regent or a board member to ultimately make a more informed decision when it gets to me? Have somebody else look into it. Have somebody else do the investigation if one's warranted. Have somebody else make a recommendation to you. But if you come out right away as a regent and say, this is terrible, we should fire this person, how can we excuse this? Then you can't let those processes develop. And you really want to make sure that for fundamental fairness to everybody involved, that you're getting a good handle on what the facts are, and what the landscape of is, both legally and in accordance with your institutional values, before you make the decision. Because oftentimes, if you take that time, then things become a lot clearer, and you can look at it and say, is this really an academic freedom issue, or is it something else? And so that would be my best advice.
Well, it's so interesting you share that. I remember more than once, as a board member, thinking something was one way, then learning more of the facts. Like there was always more to learn, and there was something I wasn't aware of. So at the surface, it seemed cut and dry. And then something would happen, or things would be explained, or the policy or the law. And it's like, oh, okay, I mentally had that wrong. And so needing the time to get all the information, which is usually the thing. But when the public's screaming at you, it can be easy just to respond. So I think that's really great counsel.
Can I have one more piece on that?
Yeah.
Which is that what I'm not saying, though, is to ignore what's causing the outcry. And because as a board member or a regent, I know that you do feel the responsibility to not just ignore something. And so it's actually sitting down and saying, okay, what can we communicate right now? And a lot of times it's not the outcome, it's communicating what you're going to do so that people know that you care, that you're paying attention, that you're not ignoring the issue, but that you're also not prejudging it. And I think that sometimes people get the advice, well, don't say anything. And if you don't say anything, people draw their own conclusions. And so you either have to figure out what you can say and then express that, or if you can't say anything, explain why.
Yeah. That the public hates a vacuum. Everyone hates a vacuum, and will fill it with what conjecture if there's a vacuum. So that's really great counsel. Back to academic freedom. It seems like everyone says that tenured professors have that protection, and adjunct faculty, part-time adjunct faculty, don't have that status. And we're not talking about full-time instructors in the middle there. So do part-time adjuncts and instructors have the ability to have academic freedom, or are they more at risk for losing their job for saying something controversial?
Can I give a true weaselly answer, which is
A good lawyerly answer?
yeah, and the answer is it depends.
Yeah.
Because, for example, at the University of Colorado, not to toot our own horn, we have been clear and have incorporated it into our policies that faculty of all ranks, adjuncts, instructors, lecturers, that they enjoy academic freedom. That other institutions, if they have not extended that academic freedom to the whole of their faculty, there could be people who don't enjoy academic freedom. Mm-hmm. And so there is a legitimate institutional decision to be made about to whom do you extend academic freedom. The piece about tenure, though, is interesting because what tenure really does is it says, as long as you're doing these things, you get to keep your job. Lecturers, instructors oftentimes don't have the same degree of job security. And if they do enjoy academic freedom, then you also have to make sure that you're protecting it. But that doesn't mean that those folks all of a sudden have tenure. It just means that there are certain factors that should not be considered in determinations about whether or not to continue or renew their employment, and their academic rights should be preserved under those circumstances.
Yeah, I think a lot of people would respond to that saying that's nice in practice, that's nice in words, but in practice, and again, the University of Colorado might have its system, but many adjuncts feel terrified for their jobs on a regular basis just because, and then tenured faculty do as well for some reason. But so that's in the world of higher ed, adjuncts feel very vulnerable.
No, and I don't mean to minimize that feeling of vulnerability. And you know what everybody knows is that putting something into a policy is important because that actually defines the rights that you have, but that what's way more important are your institutional values and your culture. Mm-hmm. If you stick something in policy, but people saying that somebody has academic freedom, but people don't believe that you're going to stand up for it when it gets questioned, then the value of that on paper is eroded.
That's a great point. Yeah. So if like the public comes with pitchforks and torches and we don't defend the academic freedom part, then it's like, well, what good is it's not worth the paper it's written on.
Yeah. And I mean, if you look at it, some of the best academic freedom statements that exist at universities across the country make that clear, which is that academic freedom isn't just something that the individual faculty member stands up and says, well, I have it. It is something that is an obligation of those within the university to protect that person's academic freedom when it's under attack. And you have to have that as an institutional value. And the best academic freedom statements make clear that from a regent to a dean to a president, that they're part of making sure that academic freedom exists.
Okay, switching gears a little bit, it seems like there's a lot of chatter these days, and always the squeaky wheel gets a lot of attention. But there seems to be more rules that are written and unwritten on college campuses that encourages professors not to speak their minds on certain controversial topics. How is academic freedom supposed to ensure there's a free exchange of ideas and there's no repercussions for talking about controversial topics?
So give me an example of where you might see that, where you've seen it.
There's a lot about around DEI issues, or people being upset with conservative speakers, or expressing a conservative point of view, like challenging the orthodoxy of kind of the campus climate.
Yeah. So that is a really challenging topic, because as institutions, we have said that we have values that we're trying to promote and goals that we're trying to achieve. And I mean, right now at my institution and dozens of others, we've said, listen, we need to be diverse, we need to be welcoming, we need to be inclusive. And those terms mean different things to different people. And somebody could say that if the example recently at Stanford Law, there was a conservative judge that got invited by the Federalist Society to speak, and there was a group of Stanford Law students who said, having this person come to our campus undermines our feeling of safety, it's not inclusive, and it's harmful just to have this person here. That pushes two things into tension, like a commitment to inclusivity and a commitment to freedom of expression. And in most cases, I think that institutions should come down on the side of, we need to create the environment where speech occurs, because once we get in the business of saying this person gets to speak, this person doesn't, it's a very dangerous path for us to walk down. But what I think doesn't get recognized is the fact that sometimes people coming to campus and expressing those viewpoints can be harmful. They can be traumatic to people. And so it's not just simply saying, well, they invited that person's coming to speak, there's nothing we can do about it. I think that is actually the time where you want to have a community dialogue to say, okay, what does this mean? And how do we support people who are in a position where they are affected by what's happening on campus? It's not just a binary of you either have to prevent somebody from speaking, or you say that person's speaking, there's nothing we can do about it. It's got to be a more nuanced conversation.
Is there a middle ground?
I'm not sure there's a middle ground, because you've got two people, you have groups that get diametrically opposed.
Yep.
Which is, you can't let this person come, and we have an absolute right to have this person come. What I think the middle ground, and the one that you have to strive for within the institution, is saying, okay, why do we have the values that we have? How does this intersect with our values? And try to promote understanding rather than agreement.
Oh, that's interesting. That we understand while we're doing this, even though we might not agree with it.
Right.
Is there an instance that you could think of where trustees or regents should advocate for dismissing faculty for expressing their views?
So my short version is I don't think so.
Yeah.
And here's the reason why, which is that in most cases, the ultimate authority lies with the board. If the board expresses those beliefs at a point in time where that decision isn't in front of them, then you can take yourself out of the ability of being able to discharge the responsibilities that you have at the right time. And so if
So
Steve,
let yeah.
you were on the faculty and you said something and I was a regent and I say, I think we ought to fire Steve. Well, then if there's actually an investigation, some reason why ultimately we might have to fire Steve, the fact that you already said, I think Steve ought to be fired means that you're not an objective decision maker. And the best thing you can always do as a regent or a trustee is preserve your ability to make the decisions that are vested within you at the right time.
That's good counsel. Very good counsel. Is there anything that we've covered a lot of ground, and any one of these topics could be hours of conversation, and books have been written about it, and Lord knows how many articles. But is there anything that you about academic freedom that I didn't ask that you think it's important for regents or trustees to know?
So what I don't think happens enough at institutions is the type of conversation that we've just had, to be able to say, here's what academic freedom is, and here's what academic freedom isn't. And if trustees don't know what those words mean at their institution, then you're creating confusion. The other thing that we talk about is academic freedom as a right. Academic freedom also has responsibilities that go with it on the part of the people who practice it. So, like we talked about earlier, academic freedom protects the ability of a researcher to be able to inquire and to publish, but it also imposes the responsibility not to engage in fabrication, not to engage in falsification. And like other rights, there are responsibilities. And way too often in the conversation, we focus on the right and we don't spend enough time talking with people about what their responsibilities are as they exercise that right. And that is a conversation that trustees should insist upon, is that making sure people are aware of what their responsibilities are, because the AAUP has,
That's the American Association of University Professors. Yep.
yeah, but they have said in one of their old statements, but I think it really does ring true, is that because of the position that faculty have, people take what they say and imbue it with a special significance. And so when faculty are engaged in public discourse, they have obligations to be able to make sure that what they're saying is accurate and truthful and is going to not bring the academy into situations where people question the legitimacy of the scholarly enterprise.
That's great. That's very good. What are there areas and specifically that you're thinking about when it comes to people understanding what the responsibility, if I have academic freedom, what my responsibilities are there?
So, I mean, the first thing is honesty.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing, though, that gets talked about in some of the literature is that academic freedom should be something that is, and this is controversial, but I believe it, which is you have to not just insist upon your own, you have to be willing to recognize others. And so that if you're a faculty member and you're insisting that you have academic freedom, you have to be able to turn around and say, somebody else who I violently disagree with in terms of their scholarship still has the ability to practice as a scholar. Because if you start saying that only certain faculty deserve academic freedom, that's a dangerous road to walk down. And then I think there's also a piece to it in terms of how should academic discourse take place. And the word respect gets thrown around sometimes. I don't think it necessarily has to be respectful, but it shouldn't be destructive of the academic process, which is based upon that there is a give and a take, that there is an opportunity to speak, that you don't um, structure academic discourse in a way that prevents it from occurring.
That wraps up this part of the interview with Patrick. Stay tuned for part 2.